Not moved.
BBC licence fee non-payment decriminalisation for over 75s bill, second reading.
Now, no. Sir Christopher Chope.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for calling me to move the second reading of this bill, and I'm grateful to all colleagues who've enabled a little bit of time at the end of today's Friday sitting to be given to a discussion of, I think, continues to be a very topical issue. Some people will have heard that today there are reports that some 8 million people in our country are struggling with their bills. And my view is that one of the bills that they shouldn't have to be struggling with is the bill for the TV licence fee, because I would like to see the TV licence fee abolished. But before we can get to that stage, and it's guaranteed under the BBC Charter until the end of 2027, we can try our best to mitigate the impact of that. And so this bill is part of an ongoing campaign of mine to try and persuade my government to decriminalise non-payment of the BBC licence fee. And Madam Deputy Speaker, on the basis that it's better to try and deal with these issues in bite-sized proportions, I thought we'd start off with that group of people aged over 75 who'd always thought that when they reached that esteemed age, they would not have to pay a licence fee at all. And because of, I think, some double dealing between on the part of the BBC when they were negotiating with the government, we ended up with a situation in which, contrary to people's expectations and contrary apparently to the government's wishes, the BBC insisted on keeping the BBC licence fee for all those aged over 75 who weren't in receipt of benefits. So we've got a situation now where a group of people are vulnerable to being prosecuted for the TV licence fee non-payment, and I'd just like to tell members of the House about what is said by some of the experts in this area. I'll give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman, of course.
Can I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way? And he's made, to be fair to him, very clear his salami slicing tactic of his attack on the BBC, which has been for some years. Has he noticed in the meantime the massive audiences for the BBC during the events following the sad demise of Her Majesty and the funeral, when in the UK and around the world people saw the immense quality of the BBC, a great British institution? Is this yet again part of the wrecking ball tactics of some Conservative members against actually the fundamental things that make this country great?
No, I don't. That's not my motivation at all. I think the coverage of Her Majesty's funeral was brilliantly carried out by all the broadcasting media, including the BBC, and I've got nothing but praise for the way in which the BBC dealt with that. But I think, to take a topical example of why a number of people feel that the BBC is not actually being true to its charter, today we've had the sad news that the Honourable Member for Chester has been put into a situation where he's being suspended from this House for many weeks, and I understand has chosen to resign and create a by-election. Has that been prominently featured on the BBC news channels? I fear not. And I think that's an example, a topical example, Madam Deputy Speaker, of the way in which some people feel that the BBC is rather selective in the way it deals with its news. My right honourable friend, the member for Bournemouth West, for example, when he was at the Conservative Party conference and then days following that, he found himself on the receiving end of some public criticism, and that was featured prominently on the BBC airwaves. And the contrast between those two cases, I think, is an example of the concerns that people have. I give way once more to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
I noticed the rather significant difference that one was a government minister and one was a backbencher.
Well, actually, I mean, they're both members of Parliament, and one of them had been suspended from sitting from position in this House for, I think, 10 weeks as a recommendation, and one of them hadn't been suspended at all, and there was no charge against him at all. So I think, I mean, in a sense, the right honourable gentleman makes my point for me. So let's go back to the issue of what TV licensing prosecutions do. Tara Casey of the legal charity Appeal says that TV licensing prosecutions are the perfect example of the criminalisation of poverty. This is wrong, particularly in a cost of living crisis. And what is the extent of the number of people being prosecuted for TV licence fee non-payment? The latest figures I have are that there were 49,144 people last year who were prosecuted, 92% of whom were convicted. These prosecutions took place in the courts, thereby creating public expense in those court hearings and a lot of distress for the people who were convicted, 92% of whom were convicted. Of course I will, yes.
Well, we have tomorrow for forgiving way. I mean, does he also not see that in a time when our courts are under increased pressure, that these prosecutions of a TV licence are not a priority? Surely he must agree with me, therefore, that on that basis, he just makes a farce of itself, really, in terms of the pressures our courts are under.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend, and that's why I hope that the Ministry of Justice, for example, which is concerned about delays in the magistrates' courts, would be saying how ridiculous that our magistrates' courts should be taken up with dealing with cases of BBC licence fee non-payment. And again, we talk about bureaucracy and the shortage of people in this country to do engage in productive employment. The BBC has said that they wish to get back to the same levels of visits to people's homes in relation to the licence fee as there were in pre-pandemic. So in 2020-21, licensing officers from the BBC visited 671,500 homes. 671,500 homes, Madam Deputy Speaker, and 62,000 of those residents were found to have been using the BBC not in accordance with the rules. But what an enormous volume of activity, which I think we should be able to dispense with. And we would be able to dispense with it if we dispensed with the BBC licence fee, but we'd also be able to take a staging point halfway if we prevented the BBC being able to prosecute these normally hapless people. The government consulted on the issue of decriminalising the licence fee, and that consultation was launched in February 2020, and it took about a year for the results to come out. And in the response, the government was actually pretty damning about the criminalisation of those who do not pay the television licence fee. And if I can find the right quote, it says at paragraph 70 of the report from the DCMS, after considering the consultation responses, the government remains concerned that criminal prosecution is, as a matter of principle, an unfair and disproportionate approach to enforcement of TV licence evasion in a modern public service broadcasting system. So there we have it, Madam Deputy Speaker. And then at paragraph 76, the government says, against this background, the government therefore intends to continue assessing these potential impacts of an alternative sanction on licence fee payers. On this basis, while no final decision has been taken at this time, the government will keep the issue of decriminalisation under active consideration as part of the roadmap to reform of the BBC discussed below. And I hope that the government, I'm delighted to see the DCMS Secretary of State on the front bench, and that I hope that the government is actually actively dealing with this issue.
Thank you for his remarks. Just to highlight the record, I'm not the Secretary of State, but the character serves as a minister in the department.
Okay. Well, I'm so sorry. I thought but He's even more welcome to that position, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's very hard to keep up with some of the changes that there are on the front bench at the moment. But that aside, this is an issue which I think needs to be addressed, and it's good to know that the government is still considering it. But we've now gone on for another year, and there's not much indication that I've received anyway that the active consideration of the issue of decriminalisation is reaching any conclusion. And in the meantime, as I've said, people are being prosecuted up and down the country, and people aged over 75 who thought they were going to have a free television licence are particularly vulnerable to such activity. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an important issue, I think. We've got a mid-term review of the BBC Charter apparently taking place this year. We're told that the BBC licence fee is going to remain at £159 until the beginning of April in 2024. And that means that if there were to be a general election after that in 2024, people will be saying, well, why has the BBC licence fee just increased? I'm not sure that that's a very, very good timing to say that to my honourable friend, but that's what the plan is. But this year, the BBC is expected to receive £3.7 billion in licence fee funding, and why aren't people more exercised about this? It's a television tax. It's more than twice the amount of money in respect of which there was a big argument at the Conservative Party conference about what the cost would be of reducing the top rate of tax from 45 pence in the pound for those people who pay that. And so putting all that in context, I would have thought that as a party that's in favour of supporting those who are hard-working families, we would be taking action to commit ourselves to doing away with the television tax, and in the meantime actually doing away with the criminalisation of those who do not pay the television tax. I'll give way once more to my...
Giving way. But could he, in his final minute, just confirm that under a Labour government, those over 75 got their television licence for free. George Osborne took that away, and that's the only reason why they're having to pay the television licence. Yeah.
Well, the right honourable gentleman and I agree on a lot of things. I'm not sure that I would put it in exactly in the way that he has, but the substance of what he's saying is correct, that we used to have free television licences for those aged over 75, and then a bit of smoke and mirrors, and suddenly we found that system no longer applied, and it was done under a Conservative government, and he refers to George Osborne, and I'm sure he's prepared to take the responsibility for that. I give way.
Thank my honourable friend. Just to confirm for the record, and the point made by the honourable gentleman, it was of course the decision of the BBC to end the over 75s. It was ultimately their decision to do it.
So it was the fault of the BBC. But you see, my reading of it was that there was an attempt to try and cast responsibility onto the BBC, but actually ultimately it was the government that enabled the BBC to retain or to put back in place a television licence fee. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Just on that point, the BBC did agree to a financial settlement with the previous government, which provided transitional funding, after which the BBC was going to take on responsibility. That was always the case, and that was the deal the BBC signed up to at the time.
Okay, so what happened? Did the BBC go back on the deal? If so, what is the sanction against the BBC? Why are we continuing to indulge the BBC in the way that we are by forcing the £3.7 billion of television tax to be paid to the BBC? We've also given the BBC additional powers to raise their borrowing limits for their commercial activities. Their commercial activities are a great success. They're selling a lot of important stuff for the United Kingdom to countries overseas. But why do we need to subsidise that with taxpayers' money? Why don't we let the BBC run their commercial arm with freedom without imposing those additional costs upon the hard-pressed taxpayers? So, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a short point, and unfortunately, there's not going to be time for the Minister to respond, so it means that this bill, the second reading, which I will move now, will have to be debated further on another occasion, when I hope the Minister will be able to respond in extenso. So I have much pleasure in proposing the second reading of this important bill.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Minister Damien Collins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd just like, in the short time I have, to address the issue of the concessionary licence fee for the over 75s, specifically to provide the necessary context around a range of relevant issues, including the BBC's decision to end free TV licences for the over 75. The government's work on decriminalisation of TV licence evasion and the government's broader roadmap for reform of the BBC, including our intention to review the licence fee funding model. The House will no doubt be aware that in the 2015 funding settlement, the government agreed with the BBC that responsibility for the over 75s concessions should transfer to the BBC. The government and the BBC agreed to make this change, and alongside that, the government also closed the iPlayer loophole, committed to increase the licence fee in line with inflation and reduce another of other spending commitments. And to help with the financial planning, the government agreed to provide phased transitional funding over 2 years to gradually...
Order. 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 Debate to be resumed what day?
Friday the 28th of October.
Friday the 28th of October.
Greenbelt Protection Bill, second reading.
Now.
Object.
Objection taken. Second reading what? Objection taken. Second reading what day?
Friday the 28th of October.
Friday the 28th of October.